Congress is considering legislation which will bar such actions. They've passed the House. They're blocked in the Senate. Republicans won't let them through. That means Republicans want to preserve the option for the president, who they hope will be their president. No Democratic president would do it, who will then reconstitute the civil service into a body that obeys the leader, the maximum leader. That's fascism. That's one of our two political parties right in front of our eyes.
Everybody, I want to welcome you to our discussion and AMA with Dr. Noam Chomsky. His work speaks for himself. Named very fittingly the father of linguistics, author of Syntactic Structures, Manufacturing Consent, and Necessary Illusions, along with countless other highly influential titles. He is laureate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Arizona, and institute professor and professor of linguistics emeritus at Massachusetts Institute for Technology. Everyone, welcome Dr. Noam Chomsky. Thank you so much, Dr. Chomsky, for being here. And I can't state how much of an honor it is to have the chance to talk with you today.
Glad to be with you.
Yes, sir. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by asking the questions that I've had submitted to me by people rather than my own questions first, because I want everybody to have a chance to ask what they want before I do. And the first question I have for you today is, when you look back at the time in which you wrote Manufacturing Consent, did you think that things would evolve in the way that they have? And what are your thoughts on how your ideas from that book have evolved since its conception?
Well, the first edition was in 1988, and we didn't pay any attention to digital media. We revised the book slightly and not much in 2002, different introduction. We brought up the internet, which was then in early stages of use, and concluded at the time it didn't really much affect what we were saying, so we didn't comment on it. There's been a huge explosion of digital media since. They've had a major impact. Certainly very much worth discussing. But with regard to the specific issues that we were dealing with, unfortunately, Edward's not around any longer. But I think he would agree with me that the basic analysis remains essentially the same. And in fact, I keep writing about illustrations of it, as do others.
Okay. That definitely answers that question, I'd say. I'm definitely interested in I just actually got done watching the YouTube documentary for Manufacturing Consent recently. But the next question that I have is, do you think that it is still necessary for those in power to manufacture consent, or is it enough to divide the would-be political opposition against themselves?
Well, they certainly think it's important. There's massive efforts to manufacture consent going on right in front of our eyes, diverting attention from things we should be paying attention to, and demonizing enemies, all sorts of things. So, for example, so many examples, I don't know what to pick. Take the attitude towards China. China is now described as the major threat to the United States all over the place. Government, press, got to do something about China's aggressiveness. So how are we countering China, first of all, what is Chinese aggression? Secondly, how are we countering it? Well, is Chinese aggression off the coast of California? So I haven't noticed it. Chinese aggression turns out to be, there are lots of rotten things going on inside China. It's not aggression. It's not a threat to anyone. It's a threat to people in China. There are some actions in the South China Sea off China's coast where China's violating international law. Yeah, that you can deal with. It's a regional question that the powers can deal with, maybe US backing. That's about Chinese aggression. Beyond that, Chinese aggression is Chinese development, growth, expansion of its enormous influence through Eurasia with the huge Belt and Road Initiative, maybe the largest infrastructure of the development initiative in history, its expansion of its trade and development and loans into Africa, Latin America, its advances in technology. That's the Chinese threat. How do we deal with the threat? Well, we deal with it by, right now, for example, carrying out enormous naval exercises in the Pacific, threatening China. RIMPAC, it's called. I haven't seen a word about it in the American press, but these are huge naval exercises reported elsewhere, establishing a ring of so-called sentinel states to encircle China. That's the official term. South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. India is a reluctant partner, refuses to take full part, armed with advanced weapons aimed at China. The Biden administration sent high precision weapons to increase the threat. All of this is what's called self-defense against the Chinese threat. It's actually got an interesting history, which if we had a free and independent press would be reporting. It's what the War Department in 1945, at the end of the war, it was called a War Department then. That was, of course, what it was and remains. Term Defense Department was an Orwellian revision, but the Defense Department outlined plans for the US to take control of almost all of the world and to contain, and the word was contain, not encircle, contain Russia with surrounded by hostile military forces, but to deny Russia the right to anything comparable. And the War Department pointed out that on the surface, this might seem illogical to have this extraordinary disparity in force and the use of force. But they said there's a deeper logic behind it. So it's a logical impossibility, illogical illogicality. That was their phrase. Well, same is true today. Our encircling China to contain the threat of China is a logical illogicality.
I can go ahead and I can ask the next question if you'd like. This one comes from Detroyer himself. He wants to know, do you think the development of the human capacity for language was more likely a slow and gradual process or something that came about more rapidly?
Well, we know a fair amount about that. I mean, there's one respect in which every capacity, including the capacity to walk, to breathe, has a history that goes back to the origin of life. Everything goes back, for example, to the formation of complex cells. But if you look at the actual emergence of the capacity as something different from general growth and development, the human capacity for language seems to be extremely recent, probably along with the emergence of Homo sapiens roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, which is an instant in evolutionary time. We were a very young species. And if you look at the evidence we have available prior to the appearance of Homo sapiens, there's virtually no evidence in the archaeological record of any symbolic activity or complex social organization or any of the other developments that would be associated with language. And we know now by genomic evidence that humans began to separate roughly on the order of 150,000 years ago. That's not long after humans appeared. The groups that separated share the language faculty. As far as we know, they're all the same, which means that language developed in that brief window between the emergence of Homo sapiens and the beginning of their separation into diverse groups. It was a very small group. If that's the case, then the emergence of the human capacity was almost instantaneous in evolutionary time.
Okay, I have another question before I let somebody else ask a question here. This one is also from Friction, and it says, do you think that the relevant capacities for language became prevalent in humans because of their relevance to language and communication directly, or was it some other reason? Example, Gracia, recursive thinking and problem solving.
That's an interesting question. From classical Greece, classical India, 2,500 years ago, up until the 20th century, it was assumed that language is basically associated with thought. Language generates thought. Thought is what is generated by language. They're basically indistinguishable. 20th century underwent several changes. One was the behaviorist revolution. Other was structuralism. It was radical change. And at that point, and the tradition was totally forgotten, but at this point, instrumental questions were raised. Was language developed for the need of communication? Is communication the fundamental sort of essential property of language? Actually, I think the tradition was correct. Language is it's not even an instrument of thought. It creates thought. It's the system of thought. It's used for communication. Everything we do is used for communication. Our style of clothes, or the way you comb your hair, all sorts of things. Language is very useful for communication, so we use it for them. But when you look into the fundamental design of language, it seems that its structure is such that questions of communicative efficiency simply don't arise. There are many cases where there are conflicts between communicative efficiency and computational efficiency, meaning just finding the most elegant solution to the problem of recursive enumeration of thoughts. Invariably, without exception, communicative efficiency is discarded. So it seems just a modern prejudice that communication is the essential feature of language. There was no things. Notice that things don't evolve for reasons. That's a mistake. They just evolve. if they have served some function, they stay. So think about evolution for a minute. I mean, evolution basically we can break it into three stages. First stage is some disruption takes place in the existing system. Could be a mutation, could be gene transfer, could be symbiosis. A bacterium swallows another microorganism. It's what the major factor that led to complex cells, some disruption or other. Second stage of evolution is that nature finds the simplest solution to the simplest way of dealing with the new system that arose. That's the second step. Third step of evolution is winnowing. The organisms that have more successful reproduction tend to persist. But in the second stage, when the system is being created, the nature has no idea about what the functions will be, doesn't pay any attention to them. It's just finding the best solution to a physical problem. That's the same is true of language evolution. We can speculate that what might have happened, very likely, is that some small rewiring of the brain took place and yielded the property of recursive enumeration of a digital infinity of objects. Then nature comes along, figures out the simplest way to deal with this. That's language. Then we never reach the winnowing stage. There's no indication that natural selection played any role after that. As I said, all people seem to have the same language faculty. Maybe that's because the time was too brief. Maybe it's because the elegance of the design was such that it's either all or nothing. Can't fool with it. There's some evidence for that now. But in any event, the idea that evolution is for a reason is just a mistake. Evolution doesn't take place for reasons. It just takes place. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You get reproductive success or you don't.
All right, I think that definitely answers that question. I have a question from another member of the audience here, Rare Seldus, that's going to ask this question, if you don't mind.
Hello, Professor Chomsky. I'm DM. I'm a philosophy student and activist. You have no idea how much you've had an impact on my thought. What advice would you give to an aspiring student to building healthy mentorships with their professor? With their professors?
Well, if it's a decent professor, they'll be perfectly happy to set up normal human relations in which you interact. You learn from them, they learn from you. That's the way interaction takes place between, certainly in philosophy. Go back to the early days of philosophy, say the Greek, the Agora in Athens. Who was the professor and who was the student? Was Socrates the professor? He was asking questions. People gave answers. He discussed why he thought the answers weren't effective. The others listened, sometimes agreed, sometimes disagreed. That's philosophy. That's the way science works too. If you're in a research lab, there may be a professor, he may somewhat direct the discussion, but others participate, often have good ideas, you pursue those. It's an interactive process. So I don't think it's the advice for an aspiring student is just to participate as fully as the structure of the situation permits. If it's a healthy situation, the structure will be very forthcoming, lots of opportunities.
Thank you so much, Professor Chomsky. No, we can move on. I really appreciate your answer, though. and I really appreciate your time.
All right. I have another question that's been submitted here by Dorth Arianis, and I will read it out loud real quick and paste it into the chat for you. It says, It says, do you think the episodes in History of Science show that propositions were thought to be known a priori and came to be rationally revised in the light of experience in reference to Quine's indeterminacy arguments?
Well, there have been such cases. Quine's indeterminacy arguments don't seem to me to have any force. I was a student of Quine's. We argued about this a lot in the 1950s. There's a good deal in print of our discussions about them. As far as I can see, the indeterminacy arguments simply reduce to inductive uncertainty. I can't see any further evidence, any further indeterminacy argument. Quine has offered some, but they don't seem to be valid. In fact, Quine has an interesting article which you might want to take a look at. 1969. It's in the New York University Symposia on Philosophy of Science. There was a symposium on language. Quine took part, I took part, a couple of others. And Quine's paper in that symposium, I think, is worth reading. What he says there is that there's an enormous gap between stimulation, data available, and knowledge obtained. And we have to be willing to accept whatever innate structures there are that are needed to explain the transition across that gap. Well, as far as I can see, that throws away everything. I don't see what remains of indeterminacy, the problems about reference, anything else. Well, read the article and see what you think.
All right. Definitely, I think that question. Oh, okay. Yeah, I think that question definitely got answered for sure. I have my own question here. I'll paste it into the chat for you. What are your thoughts in regards to the police response to the Uvalde shooting, and how can we improve our response from the parties involved?
The response to the Uvalde shooting is not to allow it to happen. Are there other countries where schools have to be fortified to protect the children from shooters? Are there other countries where teachers have to be armed, where campgrounds have to be patrolled by the 82nd Airborne to make sure that campers won't be shot? I mean, this is a specific US pathology, and a pretty recent one, incidentally. The Wild shooting is just a plague that has expanded over the United States. It was always a little off the spectrum, but now it's totally different. As for the police response, well, the press has done as much as I can say. It is kind of amazing that lots of police officers were around and there was no way to get in to stop the shooter. But I don't think that's the crucial question we should be asking is not how to improve police response, how to better fortify the schools, how to teach the children how to hide under desks. The best response should be to ask, can we extirpate the deep pathology in our social order that permits these things to happen, whether they're in schools or shopping malls or, as of a couple of days ago, campgrounds?
Yes, sir. That definitely is a very, very, very good response to that. I have another question here from a friend of mine in chat right now. His name is T Jump. Tom, if you want to ask him your questions, could you have them at the ready to paste into the chat real quick?
Sure.
Okay. And Tom is going to ask the question after he pastes his question into the chat.
So my question is the rule following argument irrelevant to the biological functions of language in the brain? And can a particular physical state in the brain count as a solution to the rule following argument?
I'm not sure what you mean by the rule following argument.
The rule following argument that the Foundations of Language by Wittgenstein, his rule following argument.
Oh, Wittgenstein?
Yeah.
I think Wittgenstein, first of all, he was talking about the use of language, not the nature of language. And what he argued is that when there's a rule, there's never any independent evidence about how to follow it. So to take his example, if you see an arrow pointing, you see what I can't draw it, but a line with the arrowhead here, you know what I mean. You don't know whether that means go in the direction of the arrowhead or the opposite direction. And he extended this argument to language. He said, if there's a rule that says a plural noun should have a plural verb, you don't know whether that's what the rule says or whether it means something else. And the only way you know, he said, is by general social conformity. This is wrong on all counts. The arrow, we have an instinctive bias towards going in the direction of the arrowhead. Could easily be proven by experiment. I imagine that dogs have the same instinct. It's never been tested, but that's surely an instinctive bias. It's not something we follow by social convention. It's not like stopping at a red light. Stopping at a red light, that's social convention, but not going in the direction of an arrow. And there's nothing difficult to understand about stopping at a red light. Yes, it's laid down as social convention. You don't have to follow it. A lot of people don't follow it. Sometimes they get arrested. But if you want to conform to the social norms, you conform to them, period. No philosophical issue. As far as the rules of language are concerned, they're not social conventions. A 2-year-old infant isn't following social conventions. These grow out of our internal nature. They're there because that's the kind of creature we are. To some extent, there's a convention. Like, do you call this thing over here a cat or a cot, let's say, as in German? Well, that's a social convention. But that's like stopping at a red light, perfectly transparent. So I don't think there are any cases of the Wittgenstein or Crippy character. They just don't arise.
All right. I have a question here that I'm going to paste in the chat as well. It seems to me as if recently what used to be genuine pursuits for the execution of social justice have been co-opted and taken to extremes by reactionaries. What can we do in regards to promoting a more patient society that listens to receive rather than listening to react on impulse?
There are old answers, the only ones we know. The answers are education, organization, mutual interchange, trying to raise the level of civilization. Can be done in lots of ways. So for example, if you go back to the 1950s and 60s, there were forms of human interaction that were considered quite appropriate that would be absolutely intolerable today. We just can't do those things because the level of civilization has been increased by activism, concern for rights of people who were not thought to have rights, concern for women's rights, which is totally different from what it was 60 years ago. Rights of Afro-Americans understood at a level which was never understood before. Well, that's how you improve society. There's no magic key. It takes a lot of work, just as was done by activists of the 60s and their aftermath. Hard work goes on right now. Many struggles about that today. But there's no magic keys, just hard, engaged work.
Okay. Thank you again for that. Do you think the Supreme Court, in lights of your thoughts on the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade, what are the next steps you expect to see from the American population in regards to that?
Well, we can have a fairly good guess about what the Supreme Court has in mind. Justice Thomas informed us about it in his concurring opinion. He said we have to go on to look at a series of cases. If you look at those cases, they concern the right to contraception, the right to choice of sex partner, and same-sex marriage. Those are the three things that Thomas said we have to proceed to look at next and probably overturn. The court is now in the hands of basically Catholic reactionaries. There is a deeply reactionary strain in Catholic culture. It's been sort of internal to Catholic debate recently, but the current majority of the justices come out of that movement. And that's the strict moral system that they want to impose on the country. It'll now be even more extreme with Coney Barrett, who comes straight out of that tradition. He's never been out of it. Well, that's a way they're imposing their deeply coercive system of moral rules on the country. The country's opposed. You look at polls, there's strong opposition, but the court does what it likes. That's been true throughout a lot of American history. If you look at the record of the court, it's mostly been a pretty reactionary institution, trying to prevent social change, social moral advance, and so on. So this is not an aberration. It's also been long in the planning. There's been a long effort. Mitch McConnell's been involved, many others, plenty of money behind it, to try to convert the whole federal judiciary into a far-right institution, working through the Federalist Society.
All right, Dr. Chomsky, I have a very, very simple question. Are you skeptical at all in the voting process in the United States? And if so, then to what extent?
The voting process is very close to 100% perfect. There have been extensive investigations. Nobody can find it. More than minuscule cases of not even fraud, just error. I mean, occasionally you find a case where somebody voted in two constituencies, in two areas, didn't notice. But it's so close to perfect that there's no even serious discussion about it. It's the effort to try to cast doubt on it as part of the right-wing attempt, and I won't mince words here, to turn the United States into a kind of fascist dictatorship. That's not a joke. There are major efforts to prevent voting by the wrong people. So for example, sometimes they're almost ludicrous, like in Georgia, to try to restore Jim Crow. The state legislature, the Republican legislature, has passed laws that make it a crime to provide a drink of water to someone standing in a line to vote. Why? Because the voting booths are arranged so that in Black neighborhoods, a person has to stand in line for hours. In an affluent white neighborhood, you just walk in and cast your vote. But when people are forced to stand in line for hours, maybe they want a drink of water. Well, that's a way to get around saying we're a racist state. Sorry, you're a racist legislature. That's happening in hundreds of cases around the country. There's something more extreme that incidentally we just learned about today. It's a very interesting report that came out today from Oxus, which is AXIOS, which makes it, which is a pretty reliable outfit. They did a study of a directive that came out of Trump's Oval Office in the last couple of days of his presidency. That's below the radar, pretty much. It was an order that reclassified the people in the civil service. Civil service is traditionally nonpartisan. It's tens of thousands of people working in government who are nonpartisan. They just do their job. But the Trump administration passed an order which basically made it possible to fire large numbers of them and to replace them with civil servants who will serve the maximal leader, Donald Trump, the God. These will be civil servants who follow his orders, not who work for the country. Well, nobody noticed it much. The Biden administration rescinded the order, but now it's back in Congress. Congress is considering legislation which will bar such actions. They've passed the House. They're blocked in the Senate. Republicans won't let them through. That means Republicans want to preserve the option for the president, who they hope will be their president. No Democratic president would do it, who will then reconstitute the civil service into a body that obeys the leader, the maximal leader. That's fascism. That's one of our two political parties right in front of our eyes.
One absolutely very, very insightful answer, Dr. Chomsky. I have another question here. This one is going to be from my friend Jen, who's in the audience right now. She has a question. At this point in your career, is there anything that still surprises you? And if you could say something to your 20-year-old self, what would you say?
Well, what I just reported 2 minutes ago was a surprise to me. I didn't think that even the current Republican Party would go that far in trying to undermine American democracy. Now, they've been doing it. This question about voter fraud is an example of how they've been doing it. All of that's part of a long-term effort to undermine the respect for democratic institutions so that they can use their techniques to try to take permanent control of the country as a minority group, minority party. That's a surprise to me. I wouldn't have expected that 25 years ago. I have expected it for the past 25 years, ever since the Gingrich Congress in the 1990s, which started the Republicans on this course towards abandoning the role of a political party and becoming what some political commentators have called a radical insurgency that has abandoned parliamentary politics. That's a surprise. I didn't expect that in the United States. There are other surprises. For example, one thing, I mean, I can't say I'm totally, well, one thing I was surprised about 77 years ago And I keep being surprised about it. 77 years ago, on August 6th, we're coming to the anniversary, the bombing of Hiroshima was announced. I happened to be a counselor at a children's camp at the time, off in the country. The announcement was made in the morning over the camp loudspeaker that Hiroshima had been destroyed by an atom bomb. Everybody cheered. Then they went off to their next activity, a baseball game, swimming, whatever it was. I was really shocked, not only at the lack of concern about what happened, but at the lack of concern about what it meant. What it meant was obvious. It meant that human intelligence had reached the point where humans were capable of destroying everything. Not yet. Atom bomb wasn't that powerful, but it was obvious that it was going to come. And it did a couple of years later with thermonuclear weapons. So here was a message that came over the loudspeaker saying, we're now capable of destroying everything. Okay, let's go to our baseball game. When I got back to the city at the end of the summer, I found that that was the general reaction. And it's the general reaction up until today. A couple of days ago, Francis Fukuyama was taken seriously, gave a talk in which he said, we don't have to worry about nuclear war growing out of the Ukraine conflict. How do I know? Well, just trust me. There was a comment about that in the Canadian press by a veteran Canadian journalist, Linda McQuaig, who said correctly that that's the stupidest comment she has ever heard, and she knows that the bar is very low. Okay, she's right. Can you imagine? It's perfectly obvious that there's a potential escalatory ladder in Ukraine, which might well lead to a nuclear war, which is the end of all of us. But Fukuyama says, don't worry about it. I assure you it's not going to happen. In fact, if you look at US official policy, could go into this if you want, I've written about it. It basically says that we should pursue that course. Official US policy is that we should fight the war in Ukraine in order to severely weaken Russia. Doesn't matter what happens to Ukrainians, we have to weaken Russia. Well, suppose we proceed to weaken Russia. Do they just say, thank you, that was nice, we appreciate it? Or do they respond with the weapons that of course they have, including nuclear weapons? In which case we're all finished. No concern, no comment about it. Well, does that surprise me? Yeah, after 77 years, still surprises me. Same is true on climate change. We are plainly racing towards a precipice. We have a little time to try to deal with the global warming before it leads to before we get to irreversible tipping points. Almost very limited concern about it. Not much happening. Nothing at all commensurate with the incomparable catastrophe that we're facing. I still find that very surprising. So there's 77 years of surprise. I never get over it.
All right. Thank you again for that answer, Dr. Chomsky. I have my own question here, and this is just, I guess, a pretty simple question. Is that in regards to Biden's recent development and his approval rating, it dropped to 37%. What do you think contributes most to that fact, and what actions do you think he should take to improve that rating among voters?
Biden is not my favorite person in the world, but he's being treated very unfairly, including by the liberal press. He's being blamed for things that are not his fault. The fact that the Republican Party is 100% opposed to any measure that he might take that would help the society, that's not his fault. The fact that Joe Manchin decides step by step to destroy every possible measure that would deal with problems that we face, it's not Biden's fault. The inflation, worldwide inflation, it's not Biden's fault. The fact that gas prices are going up, not Biden's fault. I mean, there are some things he could do. There are things he could do better, but overwhelmingly, these things are out of his control. So, and that's the reason for the decline in his ratings. It's very unfair. I don't know much what he could do about it.
Thank you again. I have a question here from T-Jump that says, Israel has committed many crimes against the Palestinian people, but if any other major military power were in Israel's place, wouldn't they be far worse? So by comparison, does that mean that Israel would be less evil than most other major military powers?
Well, we really have no other country that's in the modern period that's carried out similar crimes. So we're rightly concerned that Russia might want to occupy a part of Ukraine. Terrible crime. What about Israel? They're not only occupying territory that they conquered, but they are explicitly violating Security Council orders that say they must not settle in those areas and they must not annex them. They go ahead to annex them and settle in them and carry out almost daily crimes. Well, there's almost no counterpart to that. So it's hard to say. Actually, about the closest counterpart that I know of is Morocco, which invaded Western Sahara and refuses to relinquish it and is annexing it in violation of, in this case, not Security Council orders, but in violation of UN suggestions for a referendum. Well, I might say that in both of these cases, there is one country that has authorized all of the crimes of annexation. That's us. The United States authorized them all under Trump. It's alone in the world in that respect. So who do you compare it with?
Absolutely. Dr. Chomsky, again, I think that's probably going to wrap up what we had planned, because I think you probably have plans too for the day anyways. But I think I've asked pretty much every question, and I wanted to say again how important it has been to us to have the chance to talk to you. I'm a 25-year-old philosophy major, and I'm actually technically a multidisciplinary studies major, but your work has been very, very important to me in understanding what my ideas are and how to articulate them. And I just wanted to say thank you from amongst the community for everything that you've done in the field.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Chomsky, I certainly appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedule to listen to us philosophical plebeians.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. You have a wonderful day.